is that the monarchy thought they had a prison, but the odd thing is the monarchy sort of forgot the Hawaiian relationship with the ocean, which is sort of scary because we're not talking that long of a time. You know, it's only the 1840s. We're not talking like, you know, Hawaiian behavior was ancient history. It was still happening. So they threw a bunch of folks here on the island, and I guess they thought it was done. And there's this hilarious episode, what I think it's in one of the Thrums articles on Kaho'olawe, where all of a sudden, like 6 months later, the sheriff, who's the, you know, sort of the legal guy, equivalent of the police department then, is doing something over here and bumps into two guys over here that he'd just thrown on the island over here about a couple of weeks earlier. And it's sort of like, you know, dude, how the hell did you get here? I put you over here. And the guy just, you know, one of them just sort of innocently says, well, I swam. And, you know, you waited till the conditions were right, which is maybe 80% of the time. You just swim across to Wailea. And the sheriff was shocked and then realized that they came back another time and they realized about half the people who were supposed to be here were all hanging out with friends and relatives over in McKenna. And apparently what would happen is when I heard the sheriff was coming, it'd be sort of like the teachers coming back to the classroom. The whole group would come up here and then swim back over to Kaho'olawe, so they'd be where they're supposed to be when someone could actually see them. The minute the sheriff leaves, everyone just goes back home. So it was this total farce, I mean, for lack of a better term. But and the monarchy very quickly closes down the prison with a huge amount of embarrassment and just start looking dumb. And they go and I think they build a prison near Fort Kamehameha on Oahu. So Kaho'olawe was actually the monarchy's first prison, but it was it's not so much that as a trivial pursuit. It's the idea that by then the monarchy already had sort of lost touch with the people it was in charge of. They had already forgotten that Hawaiians, you know, to a certain extent, as with most Polynesians, lived in the water. And this was not a trip you would just do because you felt like it, but it was also a trip you could do very easily if you knew what you were doing, which they still did. So after the monarchy decides this isn't going to work as a prison, it goes back to being a ranch. And it's pretty much a ranch, but it's always a very marginal ranch. The ranchers had some small houses on the island, but they never actually lived in them full time. There was no need to have a full-time staff here because the animals weren't going anywhere. Unlike the Makai-no-Na, the cattle and goats couldn't figure out how to swim that far. So you had this ranch here, and it's pretty much out of control. Now, in its traditional environment prior to the grazing animals, this would have been an extension of the dry forest environment that you see in this part of East Maui, but even more so because of the lack of rain. This gets if Kanaio gets about 25 or 30 inches of rain, Kaho'olawe gets about 15 or 20. So what you would have had is small clumps of vili trees, pili grass, and some other smaller grasses, and probably some other low-growing vines. And that pretty much would have been it. There was never going to be a forested, verdant environment. There's also very little in the way of water. There were 3 springs. There's one over here, one somewhere up here, and I think the other one's over here on the island. But they were all brackish water springs, or I think 2 of them were. I think this was sweet water. So on one hand, you could drink them, but on the other hand, if you've ever drank brackish water, it's not something you want to repeat. So the island just basically was not really suitable for permanent habitation. There were several outcrops of bluestone, which is the rock you use for making tools. So people would come over here and mine that and make tools, and they would, you know, hang out for maybe a weekend or part of a week. Almost like you do at a park. You know, the family goes over here for a weekend, do some serious fishing, since the fishing is superb, especially on this side of the island where you've got the deep water nearby. And so what you'd have is people would go over here and do fishing, dry fish, collect stuff. They probably planted some sweet potato in spots here, but that was also more for daily subsistence. And then you go back over here. So Kaho'olawe, of all the islands, was the only island which did not have a permanent base population as far as we can tell. It was heavily used, but it was always heavily used by a population that basically saw them as their permanent residences were in this part of East Maui. So the ranch comes in, and that's one reason why it probably didn't dislocate a lot, because all of a sudden these folks, and in fact, the ranch usually had a policy, as long as you didn't whack the animals, they apparently didn't particularly care if people came over here. So at least in the early 20th century, people would still very frequently go over here, you know, do some fishing and stuff like that. And in some cases would actually claim fishing rights to the ranch owners. You know, my family's always fished here, and the ranch would go apparently, okay, yeah, we recognize your name and we know who you are, so yeah, go ahead. So it was sort of a continuation of the traditional system with an overlay of grazing animals. Now, the grazing animals did a huge amount of destruction because they wipe out the vili almost completely. Then what they start doing is they're going after the other vegetation to eat. And the end result is very quickly the island starts to get stripped. Now, in the Kona season, like I think it was on Maui last week when the Kona winds were blowing for a while, you can get some severe weather patterns and thunderstorms coming across from this section during the Kona. So rather than this being in the leash, all of a sudden, if it's Kona season, you're smack dab in the middle of this. The problem with Kona season here in Hawaii is that it's invariably large amounts of rain in a very short period of time, versus the trade system, which is generally fairly light, persistent rain a lot of the time. So if you think of a Manoa mist or the mist that we get here in Palolo, if it's trades, you can get that if you're in the back of the valley 3, 4, 5 days of the week. And it's a significant amount of water, but it's not coming down in huge sheets. In a Kona season, that's when you get the flooding. That's when you get huge amounts of water coming down in very short periods of time. So what happened is with the animals eating a lot of the vegetation, that just totally exacerbated the erosion patterns that occurred when the Kona winds would come in and drop huge amounts of moisture here. Now what happens is, whereas before the plants would hold a lot of the soil in place, now it's just like you've taken a pressure washer and you just start to pressure wash the island because the island's been stripped of most of its vegetation, not so much by the cattle, but by the goats. And in fact, by the 1920s, 1930s, the amount of cattle on the island was very small because even the ranchers had pretty much given up, and the only thing left here was the goats, which they still sort of harvested. But goat meat had become less attractive by the early 20th century. Goats were a very common meat commodity in the 19th century. By the 1920s, 1930s, it was very hard to market goat meat. People were, much more used their taste had shifted to, cattle, to beef and pork and stuff. And so what happened is, what you had was a ranch, but the animals you were raising on the ranch weren't animals that anyone particularly wanted to buy. And part of that is just the reason that, of course, over here in Maui, you had more goats than you could throw a stick at anyway. So it's not like you had any sort of monopoly on something. So the ranch was pretty much sort of devolving into a pretty part-time operation. And then what happens, of course, is World War II starts up. And the military, one of the main problems the military had is if you're practicing military things, and especially in 1941, 42, 43, when the military is ramping up in the United States, you have enormous military forces here in Hawaii, based largely in Honolulu. And one of the main things they have to practice is how to drop bombs and how to fire guns. And if you think about it, there are an enormous number of casualties that occur in the first year or two because your bombing ranges are over here at Makua and such. Some of your bombing ranges are up around Haleiwa, and some of your bombing ranges were around in Kahana side over here on the island of Oahu. And the problem was, you have to remember that a lot of these people learning how to do this stuff had no clue what they were doing. You had pilots with 500-pound bombs who basically had learned how to fly 2 weeks earlier. And they're now told to fly over something. You have to remember, in this period of time, people weren't used to flying. Most people had never flown in an airplane. And all of a sudden, now they're flying an airplane. They're actually driving the airplane, if you think of it that way. And they're now looking down at pictures of the world, because again, you have no Google Earth. So people aren't used to actually seeing the land below them. And they're told, okay, what you've got to do is we want you to fly up here and drop a bomb over here. And if you don't know what you're doing, how the hell are you going to tell Makaha from Makua, from somewhere else? And pretty soon you drop a bomb in the middle of Waianae. Because you don't know what you're doing, you're still practicing. But the problem, these guys are practicing with things that can kill people. And so the casualties and all sorts of just the messes and disasters that were occurring on almost a daily basis, because a lot of the stuff was basically run on Oahu, was just, was just getting completely out of hand. And the military was just losing it, basically. They couldn't figure out what to do about it. It didn't do any good to shift it to Maui or the Big Island particularly, well, at least Maui's case, because you had enough people scattered around here. You're just blowing up people on Oahu to blowing up people on Maui. They thought about moving it to the Big Island and did. That's where Pahakalua came in, and I think a couple of you looked at. But the problem with the Big Island is just too far away. The Big Island just took too long to get ships to, was too far. This channel's a real hassle. And so what happened in this entire process is they were looking for a place where basically they could practice blowing up stuff. But it had to be far enough away that it's someone who basically was just figuring out how to fly an airplane, or just figuring out how to fire a cannon off of a boat wasn't going to mistakenly blow up the wrong island. And they finally looked at this and realized when they looked at that Kaho'olawe was perfect. There was absolutely no way, even if you're like 10 years old, you could mistake this island for that island. Well, actually they did a bunch of times, but didn't seem there was any way you could do that. For ships sailing, this is again one of the most safe harbors in the Pacific. So it meant that you could have large numbers of boats going out here and practicing all the time, firing stuff at here. As long as you were, firing from any of like 2 or 3 directions, you couldn't hit Maui. So it was absolutely perfect. And so the military by 1942 condemns Kaho'olawe, just like they did the area around Pearl Harbor and stuff, and they make it into a military establishment or make it into a military district for the purpose of live target practice. Now they keep Kaho'olawe in that for the next, 30, actually almost 40 years. Now, as with all the other properties they had in the Hawaiian Islands, the original deal that they gave to the guys that owned the ranch is we're going to use Kaho'olawe till the war is finished, because this was a war emergency condemnation. When the war is finished, then we'll give the island back to you after we've cleaned it up. But when they promised that, I don't know, who knows? Who knows what they were thinking in 42? But the result is that they totally projected how much they were going to use the island. If you ever look at some of you can see a lot of this on YouTube. If you ever look at the assaults on Petittu, for example, or Okinawa or Iwo Jima or something like that, or watch the movies, you realize that you literally would have masses of ships. It wasn't unusual on a particular day in Kaho'olawe to have maybe 3 battleships, 8 cruisers, and maybe 10 destroyers, all firing on the island, getting ready to practice for landing somewhere in the Pacific, which means that in 1 hour, you might have like 500 to 2,000 shells up to, 16 inches. And by that, I mean 16 inches in diameter, not 16 inches long, 16-inch diameter shells weighing 2,000 or 3,000 pounds, that if they hit this campus, would literally destroy the entire campus with one blast. And you're literally firing hundreds of those in a day on this poor little piece of real estate. By 1945, effectively the entire island was covered in explosives. And a lot of these things, because they're from very heavy naval guns, and also they're bombs coming off of airplanes, including what were called armor-piercing shells, they were designed to punch through concrete or steel plate. So when they hit the island, they didn't blow up on the surface. In many cases, they'd burrow up to 40, 50 feet into the ground. And if something happened to the fuse, they wouldn't blow up. They'd just sit there, and they're still there. You can see a little bit of this. I think that's this picture here. No. Oh, I lost the picture. What happened to it? It's actually a picture of the coordinates. This was a super large bomb. I think they were using this as a test for what the nuclear bombs would do. So they actually built like a really large regular bomb. So it's not nuclear, but they wanted a really large explosion to see what it would do. And by then, of course, it's 1944, 1945, and then Kaho'olawe's like, yeah, we can do that there. And, it just sort of made sense in a weird way to them. I don't know what happened to the picture just a second ago. Anyways, so what happened is by the end of World War II, the whole island was literally covered. Now, as I mentioned, I think weeks ago, this wasn't unique. They were also using all this part of Maui for live firebombing. We still bump into ordnance all the time over here in this part of Maui. They were using a lot of the different islands and a lot of areas in the islands. Almost the entire windward side of Oahu is covered in live ordnance. The difference was with the end of World War II, the military really didn't have a huge compelling reason to keep their bombing ranges here on Maui. So they only kept the one, which started to do my work at Kanaia. They kept as a bombing range till the 1950s. And then they kept Kaho'olawe because it was so useful. And so what happened is when we shifted to the Cold War, there were basically 3 spots that stayed in military hands. One is Pahakalo on the Big Island, just because it allowed them to practice in a unique environment, a lava environment, that they thought they might find in other places, and they didn't have anywhere else they could practice that. The second was, of course, Pearl Harbor and the Pearl Harbor environs itself, including, Kaneohe, Schofield, because that was the centerpiece of the entire U.S. military establishment in Hawaii, still is today. And the third was Kaho'olawe, because what you would do is anytime you're practicing stuff here and you've got new guys coming in or a new ship or someone needs some practice, then you could send them down here and blow some more of the island up, which you'd already been pretty conclusively blown up by 1946 anyways. And as weapons change, as you move to, jet airplanes and stuff like that, so your times are shorter, and it's much easier to make a mistake. Even more so, having a separate visible island became absolutely critical, because you couldn't take the risk that someone was flying across here. They, their finger twitches at the wrong time, and you blow up part of Haleiwa town instead of Makua. So more and more, as the military became faster moving, and the ordnance, the explosives became larger and more deadly, more and more you couldn't have ranges like this part of Maui, because they were always having, whenever the planes would bomb this part of Maui, invariably someone would screw up and either blow up something in Kula, or else they'd blow up something in Wailea Makena. So pretty soon you just realize, since you're always going to have new guys coming in that you have to train, you've got to make it as sort of dumb-proof as possible. And so Kaho'olawe was the dumb-proof way for the military to practice explosives. They also used it for practicing landings. Ironically, they had to quit doing that by the 1950s, because the Marines who were doing the landings found that more and more there was a really big chance, and they were occasionally losing landing ships. They'd come on the beach and they'd blow up because someone had dropped a bomb there, the year, 10 years before, and it hadn't exploded. Until all of a sudden you drop a steel ramp on it and whack, it's just like hitting it with a hammer, and boom, the whole thing goes up. So the Marines were taking casualties from our own bombs, what we call UXB, or unexploded ordnance. So they quit. They pretty much quit using Kaho'olawe and moved out to bellows. So Kaho'olawe by the 1960s was still in constant use, but by the 1960s a new weapon shows up, and by the 1960s you're using missiles. And the problem with Kaho'olawe is it might be safe to fire a gun at it, because if you're parked over here, it's pretty hard to miss it. But if you're firing a missile and the missile has a small brain in it, and you're assuming the missile's brain is going to be seen Kaho'olawe, that's a lot riskier, because if the missile gets it wrong, the missile could end up anywhere. So what happens is they move away from Kaho'olawe, and they move out to a combination of Barking Sands, which is the missile range on Kauai, and you fire the missiles off to Kwajalein. You fire the missiles towards the Marshall Islands, because then what you've got is a seriously large piece of empty water. So there's very little way that you're going to have an oops moment if you're firing something way the hell over here. So in that situation, then Kaho'olawe starts to disappear in importance, because ironically, by the technology of the 1960s, it's too close to the other islands. So Kaho'olawe goes through this sequence, but by the time the military quit using the island a lot, which we'll just arbitrate as 1970 or 1970 is a good date. You have the island literally just covered not only with stuff on the surface, but with stuff underground. So what happens in the same period, in the 1960s into the early 70s, is across the United States, and actually it wasn't just the US, it was also in Europe and other places, because you get groups that have been stigmatized or stereotypes, or oftentimes would be defined as minorities, start to look around in the society they're in, whether it be the United States or England or wherever, and they go, basically, we've been reamed, and we don't like this, and what we're going to do is we're going to organize and make our voices heard. And so what you get is the growth of ethnic movements. The American Indian movement that I was involved with in the 60s and 70s was an example. Native Americans decided that they'd had enough of being treated as, non-existent or irritations, and decided they were going to do something about it. So among other things, they get the Indian schools shut down. African Americans start like the Black Panthers and a bunch of movements that eventually turns like the NAACP, with the idea that there's going to be some Black voice in the world that's stigmatized being Black. What you find here in Hawaii is folks that are identified as Hawaiian had gotten tired of the negative stereotypes that had become so prominent in the view of Hawaiians here, which was most entirely negative, with the exception of the tourism industry. So basically, Hawaiians were only good for playing ukulele, or only good for doing hula, or only good for, whatever, Beach Boys. But they were no good at anything that was real work. So all these horrible stereotypes that have been generated over the last, had grown in the last, maybe 80 or 100 years. Basically what happens is folks that are identified with those stereotypes in the 1960s and 70s, regardless of which group, basically start sort of collecting together, basically saying, this is bullshit and we ain't gonna put up with this no more. We're gonna be heard for what we are, rather than the way you stereotype us. And so this becomes the Hawaiian, what's oftentimes called the Hawaiian Renaissance of the 70s, is this developing self-identity of folks who identified with being Hawaiian. And one of the problems I think that happened was there were so many stereotypes, and it was so tied to the entertainment tourism industry that it was very hard to be taken seriously. That's why the Hokulea was built. The Hokulea was built to prove that Hawaiians could not only be surfers and beach boys, but Hawaiians actually had the ability to navigate across the oceans not using Western stuff, and they had done it way before Westerners ever got around to it, which was totally true. And in a weird way, people knew that in the sense that academics did, but no one in the general community knew it, and to a large part, the general community didn't believe it. So the only way you were going to make it happen is to build the boat and actually do it, and by that prove that they had this skill set. Now, one of the other aspects that then occurs is folks are identifying Hawaiian are looking around who they are in the 60s and 70s, and they're realizing that a huge part of what was supposed to be given to them, whether it be Hawaiian homes or whatever, was not happening. There was some state constitutional convention. I can't remember exactly how those happened, but anyways, the one that happened in the late 60s was when there was all going on. And one of the things that came out of that was actually legislation that the state had to follow, that basically set up an Office of Hawaiian Affairs, with the idea that Hawaiians had basically been beaten into the ground in the 20th century. And so there had to be some restitution of that, and there had to be an office that was actually going to take care and protect Hawaiians and encourage Hawaiian identity in a society which had basically devalued them. At the same time that everyone was all stoked about having a King Kamehameha statue and Hawaiians dancing hula, they were just trashing Hawaiians as a group. And so Office of Hawaiian Affairs was set up as part of the way to counter that, sort of like a bureaucratic version of the NAACP, you might say. In that context, one of the things they started to look at was all the property that had been taken from Hawaiians or the ex-Hawaiian governments in the past for various purposes, in many cases by the state, which is still ongoing lawsuits as of today, but especially the Navy. In the 20th century, especially in the World War II period, a large part of the land the Navy took that they never gave back was land that belonged to either Hawaiian homes or some other aspect of what were called crown lands. Maku is a good example, and so is Kaho'olawe. And so what happened is some of this Hawaiian identity thing very quickly sort of shifted to, in part, to we want our property back. And in that logic of property, probably the most visible example of it was Kaho'olawe. Here you had a whole island that was basically being blown completely into the ground for no other purpose than the military had wanted to. Now up to the 60s, the military needed it. But you can argue by 1970, for example, we were in the last phases of the Vietnam War. The technology had moved on. Now we were blowing the crap out of islands in the Micronesia region and in the Marshalls. So they weren't really using Kaho'olawe for anything. But by then, the Navy had institutionalized ownership in the same way they had out at Shafter and Schofield and all the other places. They had gotten used to having places, even though they had promised they'd give them up at the end of World War II. They'd gotten used and they'd got comfortable with it, and as far as they were concerned, their property. Sort of a right of possession thing. And so the Navy, when it was originally suggested in the early 70s that they give up Kaho'olawe, the Navy just went over a dead body. And boom, the fight was on. And very quickly, Kaho'olawe became the icon of Hawaiian identity in the 70s, in the very same way that the Black Lives Matter is based on the death of a series of people, and the names become Black Lives Matter, and this movement becomes the same thing. The death of those people is Black Lives Matter to a certain extent, or at least that's what triggers, and that's the symbolism of it. In the 70s, Kaho'olawe was the symbol of Hawaiianness. And so what you got was a whole mess of movements, and there's still people that are famous today, Eddie Aikau, for example, and stuff, are all part of this sort of mythos that surrounds the attempt by folks who identified as Hawaiian to take an island back from the Navy who had stolen it in the 1940s. And this becomes a huge thing. And this is why one of the biggest players in Hawaiian politics in the 80s and 90s is the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana, or PKO. And this becomes one of the icons, along with the Polynesian Voyaging Society and other things, of being Hawaiian. And one of the great advantages to that is it's really, if you're going to identify as a group, it's really good to have a counter group that's real obvious. To a certain extent, the Mauna Kea discussions the last couple of years are handy if you want to have Hawaiians that say you can't touch the mountain or the Mauna, because you've got a group that says, yes, you can, and da, 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 da. So you've got a clearly defined other. And to a certain extent, when you want to have a unifying factor, you need an other. You need a cause, and you need someone who says, no, you can't, when you say, want to say, yes, we can. And in this case, back in the 70s, it was the Navy. The Navy, for a bunch of reasons, not most of which made any sense. It was just institutional, basically said, no, we might need a certain, and the argument, because we were actually doing some work with them in the mid 70s, trying to get them to, the process of handing over the island. And, when we would argue with the Navy commanders, especially the base commanders, they'd be like, no, we can't give it up. And you'd ask them, well, why? You're not using it. Yeah, but we might want to use it. It was like they were hoarding the island. In fact, one of the admirals told us once that we might need it if we have to go to war with China. And we're sort of thinking, at the time, we're thinking, dude, we've got nuclear weapons, the Chinese got nuclear weapons. You're not going to need a little petty atoll island in the Hawaiian Islands because there's going to be nothing left. There's going to be a nuclear war and the planet's going to disappear. And they sort of like, yeah, but we might want it. And you could even point out again, if we were at war, you can condemn the island again, just like you had in 1942. They just didn't want it. And that made them the perfect poster child for federal and government excess that was intentionally anti-Hawaiian. And the Navy, for whatever set of reasons, and remember it's the late Vietnam period, the Navy just made stunningly stupid statements in public that just completely fired up a huge part of the population here who wasn't Hawaiian to support this. So Kaho'olawe became, by 1974, 1975, Kaho'olawe had become the polarizing issue about the role of the military in the Hawaiian Islands, the federal government's ability to take property and basically not play by its own rules, and how they were totally disinterested in the local society here, whether it be Hawaiian or local, in terms of keeping something even though they weren't using it. And this just went on and on and on. Eventually, by the mid 70s, late 70s, astute politicians at the state and county levels, especially Maui County, realized that saying the Navy was right was going to get you out of office so fast you wouldn't know what happened. So pretty much quickly what happens, especially at Maui County level, is the Maui County officials, in other words, your elected officials, start coming out in support of the Hawaiian movements, especially PKO. The state starts to get into it. And you end up with situations when the military would occasionally try to use the island, people would actually swim out or drop off boats and go onto the island and dare the Navy to blow them up. And the Navy actually a couple of times did, in the sense that they blew up stuff. They stayed away from the folks that were protesting by being on the island, but they intentionally kept on using the island just sort of say, well, we'll show you who's in charge. But the publicity was so deadly. The Navy found itself in a situation they couldn't win, and especially because they couldn't really legitimately argue that they needed the island for anything anymore. So then what they shifted is the fact that to clean up the island became so prohibitively expensive that they couldn't do it. And of course, that was an incredibly dumb move because the original 1942 document said specifically, we will clean this up before we give it back to you. So then the Navy was caught in a situation that legally they couldn't justify their behavior. This eventually ends up getting into Congress, and Congress basically tells the Department of Defense, and specifically the Navy, you guys have to give up this damn island. This is ridiculous. You guys have no reason to keep it. We're going to give you X amount of money. I believe originally it was $100 million to do what you'd promised to do back in the 40s. You're going to make that right in the 70s. And by 1980, what happens is the Navy gives up the island, gives it to the state in sort of a weird backhanded move. But the Navy is ordered to provide $280 million to clean up the island. And that's sort of where it stopped till recently. So here's sort of the scenery of all this. Now let's take a look at what we're actually looking at here, because it's a fascinating example of environmental impacts in whole mesa levels. Now, the interesting thing is because the Navy was such an easy poster child of bad behavior, that a lot of people tended to forget that a lot of the problems on the island predated the Navy. The Navy had just exacerbated them tremendously. So here's a part of the island. This is from about 6 or 7 years ago. This is a PKO picture, I think. This is one of the native plant restoration projects, because when the Navy was told to give back the island, part of the money set aside was supposed to be to reforest or revegetate the island, which had basically been stripped. I don't know if you can see this very well. Can you guys see the inset picture? Someone give me a thumbs up if you can.
We can see it.
Okay, thanks. If you notice here, if you look at here, this isn't soil. This is rock. With the goats that had been eating the island basically dry from the early late 19th century on, but especially by the 20s and 30s, this is why you didn't have many cattle on the island, because the goats, when goats eat grass, when cattle eat grass, cattle and horses, their teeth are inside of their lips. So when they bite the grass, there's invariably going to be a little bit left. They can't get down to the surface. On the other hand, goats actually can project their teeth out. And if you don't believe me, go and kick a goat and then turn and let your ass towards it and let it bite you. Goats basically have plier mouths. They can throw their teeth out and they can actually pinch stuff and pull it out of the ground, just like a pair of pliers. So when goats go through a piece of property, they don't eat the grass on top. When they're done, they've pulled all the grass out of the ground. They're weeding machines. Sheep do this to a lesser extent, but this is the normal goat behavior. So when goats would eat a part of this island, they'd pull all the plants out of the ground. Now, if this is during the vast majority of the year, that then means these dry winds come across here and strips all the soil off. And even today, it's not unusual if there's high winds to literally see Kaho'olawe just bleeding to red cloud as all the soil's blown off to the Pacific Ocean to the southwest. Now, when the military comes in the 40s, despite all the bombing, ironically, the goat numbers increased. And I think the current estimate is there's 15,000 goats on Kaho'olawe. The problem with the military being there is when they're there, there's no ranch. There's no one collecting goats. There's no one hunting goats. There's just goats running around all over the place. And so you had the goat population increasing. You had enormous numbers of fires that were resulting from military explosions that would set fire to the dry grass. So the end result is a large part of the island has nothing. The winds blow, and the end result is what you've got is hard pan. So there's no soil left here. The only soil is inside these little white buckets. So when you want to plant the plants there, you have to punch a hole into the rock, put a little bit of soil and put the plant there and hope that the plant can get its act together. Now, of course, the huge problem with all this is those 15,000 goats are going to take one look at this area and go like, it's like a free Burger King. So one of the huge problems on Kaho'olawe, the minute you get started, the goats, it's one step forward and two steps back, because basically all you're doing is feeding the goats. So what you also have is anywhere you see red here is hard pan. That's not bare dirt. That isn't dirt. That's rock. It's like the moon, or even images of Mars. And what that means is incredibly difficult to figure out how you're going to bring the vegetation back. One, in an area that's very dry, and two, secondly, it's got this horrendous, herbivore that basically is going to eat stuff up faster than you can grow it. You can see here they tried to put wind breakages in and stone stacks to basically break the wind speed up. And then what they're going to do is like the dry land planting on the big islands, they're going to plant on this side, and hopefully that's going to do it. But of course, that only works if you can figure out what the hell you're going to do with the goats. So it's a fascinating example of a combination of a 19th century introduction, i.e. the goats, combined with 20th century behavior, which would be first the ranch, but most importantly would be the Navy, which basically at one point or another, the entire island was in flames. So the end result is you got very little in the way of vegetation. What you do is very much exotic scrub vegetation. There's almost nothing here that's natural. And in this, so you can't see in the overlays, is just goats all over the place. So Kaho'olawe is a huge puzzle. What to do with Kaho'olawe has been a really fascinating discussion that's been going on now for 40 years. And here you see the island, and this is your vegetation on Kaho'olawe. Here's Lanai in the distance. You have occasional kiawe trees, but all this area, again, all this barrier is not dirt. This barrier is rock. It's equivalent of the parking lot. And in fact, if you want an equivalent, think of the parking lot up here behind the behavioral sciences building, where it's all been bulldozed. That's what this looks like, except there's nothing. When it rains here, you don't even get mud. It's just the water sheets off. So that means if you're going to reforest this, for one thing, what do you reforest it at? It never had a forest. It had little clumps of trees. And two, what the hell do you do with the goats? Okay. My view from the East Maui Ranch guys is you shoot the goats. They've actually tried to do that a number of times. The Navy actually in the 60s and early 70s was bringing in Marine sniper teams for practice. because I thought it'd be great practice for the Marines to hunt the goats, like they would as regular snipers, in action, someplace like Iraq. But the end result was they actually had a number of Marines get injured from unexploded ordnance, because if you're sneaking around the middle of the night, it's really easy to step on stuff, and the whole island is still covered. Only 10% of Kaho'olawe has had ordnance removed. 70% of the island has had, I believe, 50% of the ordnance removed. 30% of the island, or whatever it is remaining, is basically, you go out there and then you get blown up, everyone's going to go like, so sorry, too bad. And the Navy now estimates it would take almost $1 billion to actually make this island safe. They're just not going to spend the money. They put their $280 million they were supposed to into it. They basically said, folks, I'm sorry, but we're out of here. We've done our bit, we were told to do, and you guys go figure out what you're going to do with this place. The Marine snipers were a total disaster. The goat population, the period they had Marine snipers, they actually feared the goat population increased, so that didn't work. And then what also happened is that when the state took over, the state was going to bring in hunters, and the PKO was actually bringing in some of the folks, there were PKO that actually go hunt on Maui, as most folks do, were coming over here and whacking goats. And then what happened is you get another aspect of 20th, 21st century existence in the United States, which was Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals got involved. Because what they said is they had pictures of people shooting goats and letting the goats bleed to death, and here are cute little baby goats that are being left and their mom's dead. And so what you got is this whole sort of animal rights movement jumped all down the throat of anyone who was trying to get rid of the goats on the island. Everyone agreed the goats shouldn't be there, but the animal rights folks were saying, if you're going to get rid of the goats, you got to do this in a humane way that doesn't damage or stress the goats out. And everyone else was sort of going like, that ain't going to happen. And that's where it stopped now. No one can get rid of the goats because the animal rights folks are saying you can't kill them and can't poison them. And there's God knows there's absolutely no way you're going to trap 15,000 goats, because given how fast goats reproduce, every one you trap, you've probably got 2 new goats. What's controlling the number of goats now is literally the limited vegetation. That's the carrying capacity for the island in 2020 is the number of goats. So you're in a situation that PKO, for example, I know is really frustrated because they don't know what to do. They could build fences, but because people don't live on Kaho'olawe permanently, you can't have any patrols or anything. And right now, because of the animal rights sensitivity, even if a goat gets inside, what are you going to do? If you shoot it, someone's going to find out about it. It's going to get posted on Instagram or something like that, and everyone's going to be all over the case again. So it's sort of one of the classic nightmares, and this is getting replicated all over the Hawaiian Islands, and I'm sure it's not unique to Hawaii. The animal rights movement, which has become very vocal and very aggressive in the 21st century, sees animal control as being something that has to be done in a humane fashion, which I don't disagree with that, but at some point, if you're a botanist, for example, and you're talking about the loss of plant species up here, how do you humanely deal with thousands of an animal species that's not supposed to be here? I know it's a huge problem in Australia with things like rabbits, but here it's goats. And Kaho'olawe right now is the center of all this mess, which is how do you control a completely out of control animal population, which has basically stripped all the other animal species off the island, has stripped the vegetation off the island. You can't even replace the existing, or indigenous vegetation because the animals will eat it before it gets a chance to grow. But you can't touch the animals. Now, if you're involved in environmental stuff, this becomes one of the huge problems we deal with on a daily basis here is animal rights or animal rights groups and environmental issues, because a lot of the environmental issues in the Hawaiian Islands are based on imported exotic animals. And it becomes very weird because you can actually talk to these groups and they go, yeah, you're right. There's way too many goats here. The goats are starving to death. They're dying of thirst, and that's bad. But killing them is even worse. And if you could somehow get all the goats off the island, you can only do that in a way that doesn't hurt the goats. And it's like, okay, but who wants 15,000 goats? Assuming you can even get them off the island. So, not unique to Kaho'olawe, but Kaho'olawe is the big player. The big announcement last year was PKO ran out of money. I'm not really sure how this happened, but somehow that $280 million has disappeared, which is sort of a mind blower because that was only 40 years ago, and most of it wasn't even given out till about 25 years ago. PKO was defined by the state, since they were the ones that are interested in Kaho'olawe. The state actually made them, they contracted them to basically be the overseers of the island. And so they became in charge of the reforestation efforts. They were the ones that hired private companies to come in and do some of the ordnance removal. And as of last year, they were bankrupt. They had completely blown through the money, and they were trying to get another $100 million from the state legislature to just proceed with the activities, not even necessarily make, just to keep them going, and not necessarily to expand them. And I'm pretty sure they didn't get the money. So right now, Kaho'olawe is in a weird situation where the group that's supposed to be managing the island has now gone back to a volunteer status. They don't have staff paid, I don't think, anymore. They're waiting for the state for money, and with COVID, there's absolutely no way in God's green earth that the state's going to pay a penny for this island. So I have no idea what's going to happen by next year, but I suspect the reforestation efforts are probably completely stalled out. So I don't know what Kaho'olawe is going to look like in 5 years, but it's going to be interesting to see. But it's in some ways, it's not a unique situation. It's just because Kaho'olawe is a separate entity. It's a lot of issues that we have in a lot of the islands become really, really crystallized in a very, very clear fashion. The relationship with the federal government, the relationship with the military, who's responsible when something's been done, who ends up in charge. I know a lot of the folks in the PKO, and I don't know how they went through that much money. I have suspicions, but I'm not going to mention my class. But, now there's no money. Which means you can't afford to buy gas to take a boat out here. You can't afford to, hire a helicopter to come and drop, plantings and stuff like that. You can't even afford to hire and bring out hunters to hunt the goats if that's what you're going to do. Because among other things, I suspect you probably have to provide insurance because one of those guys gets blown up, their family's going to sue your butt. So what do you do? What do you do with an island? And Kaho'olawe is the poster child of that question. And no one has, at least in my view, no one has a 2019. I haven't heard anything this year. No one has 2019 had a clue. Feel free to go to the PKO website. They've got a lot of that stuff up there, and it's a really fascinating way to look at a lot of these issues in a very crystallized fashion. There's nothing different between this and Makua, for example, on this island, or a lot of the other areas, for example, the pollution in Pearl Harbor by the Navy. It's the same thing as Kaho'olawe. It's the same type of issues, differential powers of authority and responsibility, and how does that relate to living here? So, yeah, Kaho'olawe. It's been an interesting place. I've been out there 3 times, and whatever's. So I actually got through it. If you ever get involved in reconstruction, this is the same for folks that are working. I think a couple of you said you were doing volunteer work on dry forest in different places. Kaho'olawe is the poster child. The group that I work with out in Oahe, which is the dry area reserve out there under Arthur Madero's, used to be the Hawai'i Park Ranger. They're working on Maui because they can control the goats there better. But they've actually been one of the advisory groups trying to help PKO reforest Kaho'olawe. I know the last time I talked to them, which was last year, they just, they don't know what to do with the goats. It would cost millions to build a fence. And even then, goats can literally climb up the side of cyclone fences. I've seen them do it. They can climb trees up to about 8 feet high. So keeping, a fence that would keep people out, goats can get through. So the amount of money you would spend, and I know because we've done this on Maui and Halakala'a, the fence looks like something you'd put up between, I don't know, China and India or something like that. It's about 10 feet tall, it's braced, and it's got razor wire on top, and you still see goats on the wrong side of the fence all the time. I have no idea how they get it. I think they fly over or something, but there's just no way you can physically keep the animals out. So at some reason you have to figure out how to get the animals off the island. And if any of you come up with an idea like that and it's actually feasible and everyone's happy, you'll win the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize, or I don't know, some sort of a prize, I'm sure. So if you're looking for a real challenge, there you go. Figure out how to fix Kaho'olawe, or restore Kaho'olawe might be more accurate. Because right now, everything that anyone's tried is pretty much stalled out. So it gives you guys something to work for. Okay, any questions about all that?